what I want to do here in this last section, I know this is a longer video, but it needs to be put into one place, is I want to raise significant questions to this concept of revision and interact with the concept of revision. But before we do so, we need to have our jet fuel added to us. As they say, that is good enough to drink right there. And just think, I'm not even from the South, so I usually don't even say right there. I'm from the Midwest. So here's what's interesting. Here's the key question that I think that needs to be asked in relation to any person, Derek Brown in this case, but any person, whether it's Licona, Bach, Blomberg, Carson, or any other figure who would want to do this, Moeller, anybody who would want to revive this or to bring this about, is if we are going to update the Chicago Statement, who will be present at that council? By whose standard will we make those revisions? So, Derek Brown is one of the key figures who is leading this movement, kind of. I think it's the Gospel Coalition. He's a player in this movement to update the Chicago Statement on biblical inerrancy. Now, here's one thing you need to see is, unlike many of the others, Brown seems to, and I would actually say, is upholding a high view of Scripture. So I commend him in that regard. I think actually out of many of the calls of revision, Brown is probably one of the more conservative ones of it. Licona wants to have it, but Licona's not a conservative when it comes to doctrine of Scripture. Neither is Bach, neither is Blomberg. We know where these guys, they've pulled in from British evangelical scholarship. But many of the others who call for these changes are either not inerrantists or much further to the left. So you've got this category of people that you're going to deal with who are going to say that they're inerrantists. Remember, we talked about this in the very beginning. I'm an inerrantist. But what they mean by inerrancy is actually errancy. Just like Fuller, we are infallibilists. But when you look at what they actually do with the text of Scripture, they are fallibilists. In addition to this, you're going to have people who are claiming that they believe in the Chicago Statement, but we know how they do it. It's tongue in cheek. You know, this article needs to be changed. That article needs to be changed. And it's always in the issues, usually right now, related to something with higher criticism or something with some kind of literary criticism or something within hermeneutics. As I've always said, you can cover a variety of exegetical sins by saying you're practicing good hermeneutics today. When it's funny that why, of all the things that the Chicago Statement was going to put out, why did they put out a second statement on hermeneutics? Specifically, why did they take all the time of all the articles that they were going to expand on? They expanded on the historical grammatical hermeneutics article right there. And they had a whole other council about it. And they put out an entire another statement on it and an entire commentary on it. Because they realized that the back door to undermine this is in the concept of truth and the nature of hermeneutics. So the point is that there is a mood that is going on right now. There is a reflexive moment that is taking place within evangelicalism to update, revise, change, modify, whatever term you want to use, the Chicago Statement on biblical inerrancy. That's what I'm calling the narrative arc, the reflexive moment. And you know what? I really think that it could be very unfortunate that the Gospel Coalition has started to do this movement. And my fear is that they're going to get good people who wouldn't want to say those kinds of things or go on that trajectory to say, yeah, I see what you're talking. Oh, yeah. That's how reflexive fallacies and fertile fallacies work. That's how narrative arcs work. We need to just call it out for what it is. The Gospel Coalition may try to sell you at one point where they're going to go with this, but the net goal will look significantly different than how they sold it to you. For example, let's just look at it in this sense. You know, we need to have church that on earth that looks like the church in heaven. We need to have people and brothers at the table who have views that aren't like our white Western men. Get where I'm going with this? Oh, we need to have diversity scholarships. We need to have all this. And they sold that into the evangelical schools, and look at what it did. My point is this, is that these fertile fallacies and these narrative arcs never take you where they think they're going to take you. Never. Ever. And just like the woke movement came in and just fractured and wrecked evangelicalism, I don't see anything that's going to stop this. And there's not enough he's a good brother, he's a friend, he's a faithful champion, whatever term they're going to use that will cause me to not have some type of skepticism of that. I've seen it too many times. I'm sorry, I'm an apologist by training. I deal with these things on a regular basis. I've seen the polemics. I know how the polemics work. I know how the narrative arcs work. In fact, it's funny. I spend so much of my time dealing with those kinds of issues right now. Here's the interesting thing. You want to see the biggest part of it? The only reason that I knew about this podcast was because I saw Derek Brown like another podcast on Twitter on Christian nationalism, which is like the biggest Hegelian narrative arc that's taking place out there. So it's not just, the woke do it. The Christian nationalist movement has been doing it forever. And then it led me down this rabbit trail. So there you go. So here's another thing to consider. And I've got several of these, some key points to consider, a lot of them. One, in order to participate at ETS and other evangelical organizations, one is required to affirm the doctrine of inerrancy, but there's a clear caveat that it must be according to the Chicago Statement on Biblical Inerrancy's definition of inerrancy. So you must be an inerrantist according to the definition. L. Russ Bush was the key figure that got that definition into ETS. So here's issues to consider. If you want to revise the Chicago Statement on Biblical Inerrancy, okay, then you clearly depart from that statement to some small or significant degree. Like, you don't revise something unless you think it needs to be changed. And whatever it's saying, maybe it's a word, maybe it's a small phrase, maybe it's a whole line, you think it needs to be changed. So in that sense, you are departing from the Chicago Statement. Now, that can grow in degrees, but the point is that fundamentally, axiomatically, there's a difference of kind that's taking place. Kind, the formal sense of something. You have the formal sense of the Chicago Statement, and you are not asking for accidental changes, but propositional changes, which means it's going to have some kind of formal change within the very substance itself. Now, that can come in degrees. How much is the degree? But the fact that you want it is the difference of kind. So if you're calling for a revision, you're clearly calling for some kind of departure from the Chicago Statement formally. Now, you can say not that much, but again, it doesn't have to depart that much to be a type of departure. And the change from the propositional statement itself is the departure. In addition, if you depart from the Chicago Statement to either degree, namely a little or a lot, it raises the question of whether or not you're actually affirming the Chicago Statement on Biblical Inerrancy. Clearly, if a person came in and they said, I deny 7 articles of this, they're not affirming the Chicago Statement on Biblical Inerrancy. But no, one of the key things is that you must affirm without reservation the Chicago Statement on Biblical Inerrancy. You must affirm each year with ETS without reservation the concept that you are a Protestant and you believe in the inerrancy of the Bible. With an ISCA, you must affirm without reservation that you believe in these things and the ICBI and the doctrine of inerrancy as defined by the ICBI. So the question that you really have to look at is this, is that, are these guys departing from it? And if they are, why are they joining organizations that require it? Are they being transparent with their views? Are they being honest with their views? And I know what people say, how dare you call my... Well, it's very simple in this sense. You asked for a formal difference because of a modification. To what degree? And you've already agreed, I'm going to affirm this without reservation. So I'm honestly asking the question, how much of the statement can you revise to the point that you no longer even believe in the spirit of the statement, but in a totally different statement? Obviously, a squabble about a word here or there could lead to one actually gutting the whole statement. I mean, seriously. I mean, at what point, let's just say I have a problem with the doctrine of justification put out by the Protestant reformers. And they said, well, what problem do you have? You have a problem with the word faith? No, I have a problem with the word sola. That's a big word. So we got to take them on a case-by-case example. And the point that I want you to see here is that Brown really calls for a lot of changes to the Chicago Statement on Biblical Inerrancy. To the point that I'm like, yeah, maybe you have the ghost of Chicago. Like, it's not really a facelift or a strengthening of Chicago. It's a massive revision of the Chicago Statement of Biblical Inerrancy. And I would love to see, in one sense, if you could show literally in the logical sense of the term, and I'm talking the propositional, symbolic, logical sense of the term, if you in every single sense are not either contradicting or if you have an analytic identical statement that is being put forth in the Chicago Statement and your revisions, namely the translation of propositional statements in that regard. But here's what I also want you to see. This is kind of differentiating from Brown and just dealing with the mood on this, is that the narrative arc that's taking place here is, oh, it's just a squabble of words. It's a little here. It's the advancement of doctrine. The point is, don't argue just about this issue. Ask yourself, why are they wanting you to argue about this issue? And point out the vertical target of their narrative. The point is this. People want revisions to the Chicago Statement of Biblical Inerrancy because they don't agree with it. That's the narrative arc. That's where they're going with it. So don't deal with the squabble of, oh, Bill Roach didn't represent me here, or, oh, there's this. Those things, those little squabbles, again, why are they wanting you to argue about this? Because they're doing a lot of publications. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if there are already large publications in the works from publishers in order to just almost have a beachfront attack the second that they try to release all of this. I wouldn't be surprised. I would not be surprised. I don't know anything in particular, but I would not be surprised. The next thing, moving on here. If we are going to revise the Chicago Statement, it would have been best to do so during the lives of the original framers. In addition, what this would have done is it would have added continuity to the movement with the Chicago Statement, and it would have given the blessing of the framers. And you can't underestimate the value of that. If you want to have immediate street cred on this, you need to have the people who framed it, the people who defended it, the people who staked their lives on the doctrine of inerrancy present. And you just didn't do that. And to my knowledge, I know you didn't talk with Norm about this. I have no clue if you talked with Sproul about it, but I know where Sproul stood on some of your revisions. But even beyond Brown, we know where the revisions are going with other people. We know where their issues are. They would not have had the blessings of it. So what do you do with a guy like Henry's statements? I wrote my whole dissertation on Carl Henry, Hermeneutics as epistemology. Yeah, you know what's interesting is Henry actually wasn't even at the ICBI. He was at the Hermeneutics one, but he wasn't at the ICBI. So he can call for this, and he can even recognize the revisions of this. But as Geisler used to say, yeah, you should have done it within the time frame, not 20, 30, 40, 50 years later. And if you're going to try it 30, 40, 50 years later, do it while they're still alive. And they haven't done any of that. They haven't done any of that in that sense. It would have been best to have done it at that point in time. So yeah, Brown, I do agree with the whole statement that you can't modify the Chicago Statement. It is what it is. And these guys have passed along. It's not a perpetual organization. You can go do your own thing. You have the freedom and the liberty to go and do your own thing. But it's not ICBI and it's not the Chicago Statement. It's its own thing. You guys have the ability to do that. And we'll talk about that later. So here's my point is that Geisler and Sproul told me that's what they wanted the people to do in the first place within the framing of the organization and within their lifetime, not decades after they had passed away. Period. In addition to it, even though others call for revisions of the Chicago Statement, such as Carl Henry, they were not all framers and not all of them were actual signers. Henry was not a framer of that statement. Henry did not participate in that. He did participate in the Hermeneutic Summit, and Norm told me that Carl F. Henry didn't want to be associated with the ICBI during that time. It was only later, after it was received so widely, that he decided to join them. Makes you wonder why. Now, I'm not questioning whether or not Henry was an inerrantist, but Henry sort of had this issue of he didn't like Linzel's Battle for the Bible when it was dropped. He thought it was going to cause all this chaos. In fact, Carl Henry didn't even want to see the conservative resurgence take place at Southern Seminary because he thought it was going to be so divisive and bring such a fracturing to evangelicalism. But then you also look at some of these guys who are calling for it. In fact, let's just look here real quick. Yarborough wasn't even a signer of this. I know Grudem was a signer of it. Actually, Grudem put this book in his updated systematic theology. And some of your other people, your committee and all the rest, they weren't even there. They're speaking years later. Like, they're literally falling under the critique of this. Like, they may want to make these changes, but the time has passed. Like, there comes a point in which you can't ratify the Constitution anymore in that sense. Like, oh yeah, we could, hypothetically, all these political geeks are going to get out there. Point is, the U.S. Constitution was its Constitution. You know, you make a legal contract to buy a house, you can't change it after a certain time. Like, you kind of had your opportunity. And many of these guys, they had their opportunity. At this point, you need to not just say we're updating the Chicago Statement, you need to do your own thing. So, at this point, when people call for it, I ask, so what? So what? These guys call for it. So what? Like, who are they? They're not the framers. Many of them were not the original signers. They're just guys years later that have issues with it. So what? I don't want to belabor that too long, but okay. What's your point? What's your goal? And that's why you bring in all of these other things about narrative arc to fulfill it. So at this point, we need to look at this is that I was aware of Brown's dissertation and spoke at length with two of the living framers about it. And they both agreed that his revisions in many places were either just pedantic, redundant, and sometimes contradictory with the intention of the framers. And note, the clear propositions of the statements itself, the propositional truth, it's not like you have the proposition and some other intention that modifies the proposition. It's as very clear as this. Texts mean what they say and they say what they mean. Meaning is found in the text. And that's why they codified it into the document itself. That's why they gave us explicit commentaries above and beyond just the statement in and of itself. Because of these kind of revisions that they knew that were going to take place. So overall, we must ask why there is such a resurgence to revise this statement now that the original framers have passed away. Why not 10 years ago? And I know you're like, well, I was working on it 10 years ago, but you didn't have the movement 10 years ago. Well, why not 20 years ago? Why not any of this? Notice this. I think that there's a lot of reasons, and this isn't not just to Brown. This is just speaking broadly. One of the reasons that they're doing this now that the framers have passed away is that the framers can no longer personally defend the statement. They're gone. They left us a whole host of writings of which people will then use their hermeneutical games to give interpretations of their interpretations of their interpretations. Turtles all the way down, if you understand the joke. But what you have to see is that those writings are their clear expectations that they don't want this to happen. And they're clear explanations of what those doctrines mean. In addition to it, they intentionally raised up an army of disciples who will not be easily duped. Like, I can guarantee that there are a lot of people out there who were, we used to have this term that I used politically called rush babies. Like, you hear that, everybody calls them a rush baby. They were raised at the microphone of El Rushbo, king of Realville. Well, there's a lot of people that were raised as Geisler babies and Sproul babies and all the rest, who are not going to be duped into a lot of these new revisions that a lot of these people are going to try to bring about. Again, Brown, I'm not just talking about you. I'm talking about a lot of people, many of them whom we talk about here, many of which are walking the halls of ETS on this very day. Moving on. The next thing. Brown seems to suggest that it is a burden on my part or anybody else's part who would hold my view to show that his views are not in continuity with the intent of the framers. First of all, intent of the framers is a very nebulous concept. What do you mean by that? Propositional continuity, mood continuity, intent. Like, I understand where Hirsch is going with this. I don't follow Hirsch. I understand the idea that authors control the meaning of the text, but when you have the text controls the meaning of the text. So what I really need to show is that what you're doing is not in this intent of the framers. That's such a nebulous concept. Somehow I have to get to the mind of the framer, of which we don't have anymore, which is interesting that they're not here anymore. But yet I've already had those kinds of conversations that have spoken about this. And you want to have sort of this authoritative concept in that regard. Again, first of all, I've already had the verbal articulation from two of the leading framers, Geisler and Sproul, that Brown's suggestions, as well as many other suggestions, I'm not just trying to pick on him. I don't want people to think I'm just picking on him. A lot of the suggestions, Ben Hooser's suggestions, other suggestions from higher critical scholars, the big conferences at ETS, all of these things are not in keeping with the original vision, mood, spirit, intent, whatever of the ICBI and the Chicago Statement's framers. Second of all, as it relates to this, Brown, I understand what you're trying to do, and I understand when other people are trying to say, I'm in keeping with the intent of the framers, but you have given us an impossible standard to meet. Literally. I cannot give that to you, as neither can you give me that standard, and here's why. Inherent within this is the idea of the intentionalist fallacy, and it can also be called the intentionalist theory of truth, that meaning or truth value is found in intention, not necessarily correspondence. Because if it's in correspondence, then I can look at the correspondence of the intention as it's readily expressed in the meaning of a text in and of itself. So what the issue is this, is that say I put a text out there and you read it or somebody reads it. Let's just say I am reading Romans and I go, man, I really wonder what Paul said. And I said, you got to get to the intention of Paul. And well, Paul's just sitting over there. So I go over and I say, hey, Paul, what do you mean by, let's just pick a really funny one. All Israel shall be saved. Let's pick a non-controversial one in the book of Romans. All Israel shall be saved. So then he tells me what he means by that very statement. And we go, awesome, great. We figured it out. We know the intention of Paul in this. But notice, I have the material sign of the text with the formal element of Paul in there. But in order to read that text, I then have to ask Paul for his intention. So then he gives me his intention, which is then put into another material sign. So then I'm left asking this question. What does he mean by that? What is the intention of Paul there? So in order to get the answer, I go and ask Paul, can you tell me the intention that you are giving me about this propositional statement, explaining the intention behind the propositional statement in the text of Scripture? And he goes, yes, I can. So he gives me one. Now I have another formal text of his intention that explains the intention that explains the intention. Well, I got to do it to that one. It goes on, and on, and on. This is what's known as the intentionalist fallacy. And what goes on here is this reality that it's an infinite regress of where the burden of proof must lie. So if you say, well, we don't want to believe in that, we're not buying it. This is not postmodernism, buddy. This is none of this. This is not postmodernism. This is not we can't have the concept of truth. This is the old third man fallacy of Platonic ideas of how we justify truth statements. Okay, you've got the form exemplified in the material thing itself in the real world. You got the form as it hits, and you got the participation. And what was Aristotle's critique of this? Okay, how do I adjudicate between them? The third man. It's his third man argument. The intentionalist fallacy is picking up and piggybacking off of that concept here. So the issue is that if he wants the proverbial buck to stop somewhere, well, it can't stop in the intention of the author, because that's an unknown, undisclosed thing. But how do authors make their intentions and their mind known? Through verbal and written articulation, namely in a text. So meaning is found in the text, not behind, beneath, around the text. This is exactly the kind of stuff that has me concerned with where Brown is going with this. I see it just in the way he interacts with me over these matters that give me significant concern with this. Hermeneutics and the idea that it's behind, around, above, beside, all of it is Schleiermacher's divinization of hermeneutics. And if you want to see a lot more about that, go see my talk that I gave with Sovereign Nations titled Hermeneutics or Perspectivalism and Hermeneutics or something like that, or Hermeneutics as Perspectivalism with Sovereign Nation, in which I interact with how Schleiermacher's concept is there. You can say, well, I don't follow Schleiermacher. You do here. And in fact, this is what Thistleton and Gadamer, Heidegger, all of the extensions of this are calling for. And Hirsch pushed back against it, but he still gave us idealistic hermeneutic It is keeping the continuity of the idealism that cannot be grounded. So my point is this, is that when he asks for this standard, it already lets me know that Brown or any other figure is beyond the Chicago Statement on Inerrancy, because they are asking for an intentionalist theory of truth to be the standard, not a correspondence view of truth that one finds in the clear propositions of the Chicago Statement and the correspondence view of truth, which is the long heralded view of truth, realism of the West. And the Bible is very much a philosophically realist book. So when we give our thesis in this sense to the book, I know this. I know what one pushback is going to be. We give the thesis of the book, Defending Inerrancy, that the Chicago Statement must be interpreted in accordance with the framers' intent. We have one thing that Brown doesn't, namely the verbal articulation of the framers while they were still alive. So we're asking for this. We want people to interpret according to its propositional sense. And when people tried to bring these intentionalist things, we had the authors already there who did what we were talking about by saying, that's not what I meant by that. We had the commentaries on that. They have already spoken on this. So you want this burden of proof. One, de jure, it's impossible to give. But two, in a light, restricted sense of this, we've already done that. Kind of been there, done that, moved on. That's why we had the publications. That's why we started all of this. Let's keep going here. We got a little bit more to go here. Like I said, this is going to be a long one today. So, in addition to this, if we are going to revise the Chicago Statement, what I want you to see is that it will no longer be the Chicago Statement on biblical inerrancy. Specifically, if we add in the number of revisions that a person like Brown would want, or whatever this council, the Gospel Coalition Council, or whoever it would be, would put. The revisions either Derek or any other figure are asking for, especially to the degree that they are asking for the revisions, make it a completely different statement. Seriously, go read the revisions that he wants and just compare them. Just add the number of words up and look at the difference between them. It's a significantly different statement. It's a formally different statement in so many regards. In addition to it, it is no longer the Chicago Statement on biblical inerrancy because of those kinds of revisions, even though they claim to be in the spirit of the Chicago Statement, whatever that means. Yes, I understand the history of that concept, but I don't know how they're going to use the history of that concept in that moment. We're keeping in the spirit of Chicago, whatever. But my point is that at what point is it no longer the Chicago Statement? It's a historical statement at a particular time for a particular place in history. Like the U.S. Constitution was the U.S. Constitution historically. You can't just revise it. You can't revise it and say any more than I can go revise some ancient document that written on a stone that we unearthed when, some archaeologist who is having a heyday in the middle of a field can revise it. Like the Chicago Statement is the Chicago Statement. You can say where you differ with it. You can say things that you think could be better in it, but you're not the Chicago Statement and you're never going to be the ICBI, period. In addition to this, given what we know about the current state of evangelical scholarship, we know that several of them buy into hermeneutical and philosophical practices that undermine the Chicago Statement on biblical inerrancy. So, if we added many of the claims from figures who espouse the new quest for the historical Jesus, we would have to add in all of the various forms of criticism, literary criticism, redaction criticism, genre criticism, Greco-Roman bias, midrash, all the rest, all those things that I talk about that the Chicago Statement not only warned about, but said was outside of the bounds of inerrancy in and of themselves. So again, by whose standard? Who's going to be on this? It's not just going to be one figure. It's going to be a group of figures. I guarantee those guys are going to want to place at that table. They're going to want to understand the Bible in its literary sense. And by literary sense, it's the literary criticism sense. Notice the Bible has different genres. Yes, that is a literature in that sense. The Chicago Statement recognized there are different types of literature within its very text, but they didn't buy into the literary criticism that so many people brought into that text. In addition to this, If we added many of the claims from present-day figures, many of whom had developed modern approaches to hermeneutics, we would have to include views of language, truth, and literary criticism contrary to the Chicago Statement. For example, I can guarantee many of these people today are adamant that they would want speech act theory to be reconciled with the Chicago Statement. We showed in our book that it was contrary to it. I showed it in my dissertation that Henry thought that it was contrary to it. In particular, the reasons for it is what it does with the relationship of intentions and propositions. And we've seen how people have worked with this. What a lot of people will do is they're going to give a speech act theory and they're going to specifically argue, and it's illocution, perlocution, and all the different effects that they're going to have with it, that there's a discontinuity between them. And the point is that we don't just have all of these illocutions. All we have is locutions. I'm not worried about what the text can do, the function of the text. I'm more interested in what the text is. And it's so funny because a lot of people will jump to the Timothy passage, and all scripture is inspired, for, and see, it's what the scriptures do that make them different. No, it's because of what they are is what they make them different. They are the very words of God. Therefore, they can do these things. But I guarantee they would want to have speech act theory. And I've seen how speech act theory, we can talk about it. They're using it as a way of waxing eloquently to use an intentionalist concept to say, oh, the propositions don't mean what they say. Commands in the Old Testament aren't really commands because we know whatever thing they're going to add to it. In addition to this, many of these figures, such as Mike Licona, would want to incorporate Greco-Roman bios into their understanding of the Gospels, but in doing so, Licona has proven to dehistoricize the Chicago Statement and undermine many aspects of that statement. Some people would also want to have non-historical narrative genres applied to the New Testament, which, like the other genre criticisms, had demonstrated that it will fundamentally undermine the historicity of the text under the guise of, we're just doing good hermeneutics. I wrote a whole critique of this, and we dealt with it in 2 other books here. We have the vital issues in the inerrancy debate, where we lay out so many more of these. It's not just defending inerrancy, but also this lesser known book titled The Jesus Quest. We lay out many, 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 many more ways that this could and would take place. In fact, I don't have it right in front of me. Go look at The Jesus Quest by Farnell. Oh, did you hear this screech? Did you hear it? Those are all those guys they critique going, ah, the junkyard dog. How can he say that? It's funny. I love what Farnell does with them. Great brother in the Lord. So another thing that we need to look at is this. Continuing on, Derek Brown acts like we're just updating the statement to reflect good developments in our doctrine of Scripture. And in fact, they're all going to say that. It's not just Brown. He's just the one who's been saying this. But if we have seen anything throughout the evangelical world since the release of the Chicago Statement, it is that there have been many not good developments of our doctrine of Scripture, or it is that there have not been good developments of our doctrine of Scripture. Yeah, maybe here or there, but not in the whole. Since there have been good works published, and we realize, yeah, sure, we realize there have been good works published by, solidified, already established standards, but many of those things are not really new developments. They're not saying anything beyond what the Chicago Statement has already said. They really haven't. Most of the new developments are the watering down or the changing of the clear things of the Chicago Statement. Like the Chicago Statement doesn't buy into reader response hermeneutics. It doesn't allow for speech act theory. It doesn't buy into like the Janine Brown, the Thistleton, the Gadamer, and all of that kind of stuff, which is where many of these developments are going to come in. However, what we have found is that the overwhelming amount of scholarship has demonstrated a move away from the classic evangelical view of Scripture towards neo-orthodox and liberal views of Scripture. And here's what I want you to really see. There was a time Ken Conser said this, that there were so many people who were excited about Barth, because he wrote on Barth and all the neo-orthodoxy, because Barth was going to save all these guys out of liberalism. He's going to pull them all out. He's going to get all these liberals, and they're going to come into our evangelical view because he's salvaged a way to reconcile the doctrine of Scripture and so on and so forth. But what he said is that unfortunately, it actually pulled more evangelicals into neo-orthodoxy and liberalism than it did the opposite effect. And I think that's exactly what's going on here. And I think this is what the statement would do, is it would actually be a means of people to lessen the boundaries by the revisions of whomever this team would be. For example, would William Lane Craig's whole mytho-historical approach be used, which fundamentally uses ancient Near Eastern genre criticism which undermines and guts the Chicago Statement, would that be allowed? Would that mytho-history approach? Guarantee you Bill Craig would be involved with this. They would want to pull him in on this. Guarantee they would want to put him in on this. And he's going to fight for it. And I think he'd probably win, given that group. In addition to it, given the current state of affairs, figures such as William Lane Craig, Lycona, Blomberg would most likely demand a place at that table to revise the Chicago Statement. In that sense, I actually wouldn't trust those figures, that they would preserve the integrity of the revision, since so much of the scholarship that they've put out already undermines it. So if you give them the chance to give a formal document, you know where that's going to lead. The whole move of, hey, we just want to stay up to date, seems to ring more true of a debater's trick than a real substantial critique. Hey, we just want to keep up with the latest of scholarship. Hey, we just want to keep in the mood of this. Or let's just change the whole thing. Hey, we're doing critical social justice. We just want to fight racism in society. We just want to be up to date with this. It's the mood. It's that whole dialectical concept of it. Just be clear. Just be clear. And Brown's going to say, I am. Well, the others, they've been clear. Those are the ones that scare me even more. So here's another thing to consider. Let's just say hypothetically, if we do allow for a revision of the Chicago Statement, and given what we know about many of these leading evangelical figures, they would not add to the clarity of Scripture, but subtract from the clarity of Scripture. Again, what we know about them, they would not add to the clarity of Scripture, but subtract from the clarity of Scripture. Now, I do believe that most of whom would pick for this revision, namely, let's read it in this sense, many of the evangelical figures, most of whom that they would already pick, would do this. And I say this little caveat, I don't think Derek's so bold as to say he'd be the only one. I guarantee he wouldn't want to do that. It would be like career suicide for him to be the only one to do this and be practical. Like he would have, if he thinks it's bad now, publish that kind of thing and see what it's going to do. It wouldn't be fun for you. But my point is that given this body of people, which body, whom, why, and we see what they're doing, they're not actually clarifying their doctrine of Scripture anymore. It actually is subtracting from the clarity that we already have. So here's what I want you to see here. Brown spends most of his dissertation and publication squabbling over words and so forth. He offers slight suggestions here and there that subjectively may or may not add clarity depending upon the person reading the statement. So sometimes they're bigger, sometimes they're longer. Some to the point where I'm like, that's just too much. Some it's like it's a little point where it's redundant or pedantic. But again, it comes down to clarity according to whom? The people sitting in that room that day? What about people who are not sitting in that room today? Who determines whether or not it's clear and the revision adds clarity to it or not? And I know that can be applied to so many things, but it has to be applied here. Like it's a legitimate question. If you're going to allow the standard of good development of Scripture and doctrine and all these things to add more clarity, clarity to whom? By whom? By what standard? To the church or to the secular academy? To the evangelical world or to the politicians? To this religious group or that religious group? And that's not just a shifting of the cards. It's a legitimate question. Clarity according to whom? Because then if you go, well, the statements in and of themselves are clear, I can't help that somebody else just doesn't understand it or they find issues with it. And I would say, what's sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. The Chicago Statement is very, very clear. And they think that their propositions are very clear, and they wrote an extra commentary to ensure that their statements are clear. So if it's just an adding to the clarity, they're clear. That's why I'm saying a lot of the things are equivocations of terms, sleights of hand, scholarship that's being used in one way that can smuggle other concepts in. I've seen what's gone on. In addition to this, many of the word selections and changes that he and others make are due to present day confusions over words or a doctrine. Like he wants to use God breathed instead of inspired because, some people don't understand this concept of inspiration. However, almost immediately, this is what I want you to see, almost immediately upon publishing the revised version, that own statement by that group of people or any other person would fall prey to the exact same criticism. Namely, people would develop new issues and concepts that would call for more clarity, and this could go on ad infinitum. The point is that if you're allowing this issue of people don't understand therefore we should make this change or these issues with it, that can be applied to anything at any time, at any place, including your statement, which would call for an endless amount of revisions. And in fact, if you want to kill the concept of confessionalism, give a committee that's going to give a committee, or have a committee that's going to tell you what another committee said. In fact, what's so interesting is, coming Southern Baptist in this regard, Moeller even talked about this. If you got to have a committee to parse out every word of your doctrinal statement for revision, clarity, extra clarity statements, confessionalism is dead. And what you want to do could also be done to your own statement. So the deeper issue is that we do not have to revise our statements whenever we find there's confusion in culture about a statement or the statement. There are a variety of reasons a person may misinterpret the Chicago statement or any statement. However, we should not allow the mass confusion in our present day amongst all quarters of the theological spectrum be the litmus test for whether or not our doctrine or scripture is actually clear. Rather, if the real issue is they don't understand it, then it is our goal to go out and to clarify that already existing document. Moreover, in theory, we could label the same changes to any document from any era against any religion for any reason, just because they don't understand it. Why not update Nicaea or Westminster? And he says, well, it's because they're creeds and they're already set, or Westminster. But he claims too much in his whole clarity concept. In fact, if clarity and misunderstanding is the standard and people don't understand this, then we could undermine even that new statement or any statement and call for a revision anytime somebody doesn't understand a particular statement. The point is that if clarity is your issue, then explain the statement as it is in its own words. But if every time we have to revise something because somebody doesn't understand it, that is opening up a gate that I'm not willing to go down. I think it's the death of truth and the death of confessionalism. So, in addition to this, Brown and others seem to suggest that there are contradictions within the Chicago statement. Okay, contradictions. A and non-A are affirmed at the same time and at the same sense. I personally find his assessment in this incorrect and a rather surface level, rather than formal contradictions. Like, I don't see the formal contradictions. He may say that there's something that seems to pit one another against this, but what I want you to see is this, is that I don't think that those guys wrote a formal contradiction within their text. Maybe you think things are pitted and maybe things struggle within this, but many of his articulated changes are also not very clear and seem to contradict the CSBI. So notice this. I don't think, one, that there are actual formal contradictions in the Chicago statement. I don't think his assessment of what he thinks are formal contradictions within the Chicago statement are actual formal contradictions in the statement itself. But where I do find real contradictions are his revised concepts sometimes do contradict what's going on. You say, show me, show me, show me. If you ever publish it, because that could be a wax-nosed document until you actually publish it in a real meaningful sense, I'm not going to give those out. Like, I will say more about this later should you publish that. In fact, several of us from Defending Inerrancy will publish a full-length book responding to these challenges and others, kind of what we've been doing here. So, some of my bigger questions here as it relates to this. Would you allow myself, the Defending Inerrancy team, Dave Farnell, Wynn Cordwin, and others into your revision meeting? If not, why not? The real answer is that it would most likely be a conglomeration, as we said, of people from the Gospel Coalition who are in favor of that. Like, that's the narrative arc that they're putting here. Now, Brown, well, writing a dissertation on the topic, would likely be invited. So the point that I'm trying to look at is, what is this group going to look like? He'll be invited to the event, but he's not going to be the leader of that event. I can speculate about who that might be and who they would want to have overarching control, and they would be good speculations. Ask yourself, which man thinks he needs to be in control of all of evangelicalism? I might actually trust that one individual on this issue, not others, but again, speculation. But I can guarantee that the new group that's brought together, whomever they bring in, would not be as conservative as the original Chicago Statement of Biblical Inerrancy. Guarantee it. We're just not as conservative today as we were 30, 40 years ago. Society or within evangelicalism. So this revision that's going to take place is not going to look like what Brown puts out. I hate to say it, Brown, your statement is going to be your statement. You may get like a half a dozen people and say, oh, we're going to do it. It's going to happen. I've got charge. I got people that want this. Good. But the final form, we like that concept, final form of Isaiah or whatever they're going to say. It's not going to look like the final form that you put out. It's going to look significantly different than what you think. There would be people who would be much more radical in that group than even what Brown pushes. Brown would probably push back against them. I also think that given the mood of evangelicalism, it would also be a diverse, inclusive, equitable group of individuals. Diversity, namely training in critical consciousness. Inclusive, which means excluding those who are not trained in critical consciousness. Equity, Marxism. And that's why, I've seen this. I've seen this at Southeastern Seminary, where people in doctoral seminars were saying, we need to have a new reading of Nicaea that's not white, Western male, Asian reading, feminist reading, blah, 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 blah. Well, why can't you do that to your doctrine of scripture? Why wouldn't they? Given the mood of this, I guarantee they would have something in relation to that smuggled in the hermeneutics and so forth. So let's keep going here, trying to pick it up here. Next subject. If the goal is to enlarge the doctrine of inerrancy to include many things that fundamentally undermine inerrancy. Now, I don't know if Brown would do this, but I think that's what many of these people want, is their end goal within this evangelical movement is to enlarge, expand, redefine, or revise the concept of inerrancy to include many things that have not historically been in the one that's from the early church, into the medieval, into the Reformation, into the modernist fundamentalist debates, into the neo-Orthodox issues, into the evangelical issues, and into the Chicago Statement. They want to expand beyond that, which I would say would fundamentally undermine the doctrine of inerrancy in ways that we've already discussed. So, another thing, you cannot revise history. Whatever you come up with, it won't be the Chicago Statement. On the other hand, my point is this. I would actually love to see you guys put out a statement. I would love to see these evangelical guys take the time and the effort and the publications to put out a statement on what they truly believe about the Bible. And here's why. I think it would give the average person the clarity that they desire on where their pastor or where their seminary teacher or where their seminary actually stands and teaches about the Bible. Seriously. So in that sense, I'm up for it because I want you to be clear. Now, you can't change the Chicago Statement. Make your own statement. Period. That's where I stand on this. Make your own statement. You can, use the Chicago Statement as an outline, but it's not that anymore. You can't revise history. You're not the new ICBI and you're not the new Chicago Statement. But I think you would do a lot of good for people because then we could see exactly where they are. I think, in fact, I wonder if they would actually be clear in that new statement. Because I wonder if they were clear, if it would actually smoke them out on where they really stand on many of these issues. In addition to this new push would be not only to revise the Chicago Statement, but I guarantee they'd revise the Chicago Statement on biblical hermeneutics. I've always said hermeneutics can cover a lot of exegetical sins, and many people will use these revised statements to bring in approaches to hermeneutics that fundamentally undermine the literal, historical, grammatical interpretation of Scripture. The point is, you cannot fundamentally separate one's doctrine of Scripture from their method of interpretation. You can distinguish between the two, but you cannot fundamentally separate them. So it's not just a revised doctrine of inerrancy, it's going to be a revised doctrine of hermeneutics. And over again, it has been shown that the way a person handles the biblical text shows you more than what you claim to actually believe about the biblical text. There's a lot of guys saying that they're inerrantists, but when they take up their pen and they write their commentaries and they write their papers and they write their things about it, they go to show they are not following the inerrancy of Scripture. So, final thing here. I get this mood, some from Brown, but more from others, and it's like a smug mood when we talk about this. And it's something like, watch me. Me and my friends are going to do it anyway. And I get it. Watch me. We are the champions. We have arrived. And here's really what I want you to see, and I speak very honestly with them. I honestly do not think that you will garner the level of unity among your new panel of scholars that they had during the Chicago Statement. There were differences then. I mean, go look at the Hermeneutics book. There were differences on hermeneutics between some of these people. But what I want you to see is you're not going to have the same amount of unity that you had at that point. I honestly see that as a point of unity that God gave us in his good sovereign providence. In addition, there are honestly more disagreements between this new group, them, than disagreements amongst the framers of the Chicago Statement. Look at these guys. Go to ETS. These guys disagree with one another about everything. Look at these key leading figures. They disagree about several things all the time. In addition to it, you will not garner the level of acceptance of this new statement as that is the Chicago Statement on Biblical Inerrancy. You may get ETS to adopt it, but you're not going to get all the other conservative schools to adopt it. I guarantee I wouldn't adopt it. Sorry, I know the guys that are playing in this. And I think that the Chicago Statement, even if you publish it, even if you take all the time and all the effort and all the rest, is still going to be and remain the standard going forward. The revised statement will just be the alternative. It's going to be the knockoff brand. It's going to be viewed as the progressive, and do it. And you're like, well, I'm not a progressive. You're not the one who's going to control all of that statement. You're not going to be the one who's going to control the definitions. You're not going to be the one who's going to control who's in the room. Sorry, it's not. And when people get to see what's actually going on, I think it's going to cause more concern than just sticking to the Chicago Statement of Biblical Inerrancy. In addition, I doubt many of the confessional schools who have adopted this Chicago Statement will adopt the revised version. ISCA won't. Many of the other conservative schools won't. I just don't think they will. Like I said, I think the only organizations that may accept it would be the progressive branch of ETS. I actually think it would fracture and split ETS. I think you would have people within it that would just leave. And I would say the doors are always open at ISCA. And I think EPS, which ironically doesn't accept the Chicago Statement, that's why a lot of people run the back door through EPS in order to do this, would possibly do it. Mainly, I think they would do it because many of these figures operating with those organizations already fundamentally undermine the Chicago Statement. And this would just be like the logical outworking of their scholarship as it currently exists. Like, yeah, they want to do this. Because then they can say, well, I'm in accordance with the doctrinal standards. Yeah, the new doctrinal standards. Like if I can revise things, I mean, I can join a lot of organizations if I can revise the standard in and of itself to what I want it to be. So here's my point. I know we have gone a long time on this, but it needs to be done in this regard. This issue and this beckoning call they're giving is going to bring a lot more heat than light to the situation. It already has. And it's going to continue to bring more. In addition, it's going to create a lot more divisions than unity. And I think if we find anything, I commend honest, real scholarship, but it has to be done within boundaries. And I know these people are saying, I'm doing it within the boundaries. Formal statements themselves and things that I see are clearly not within those boundaries. So here I stand. I can do no other. We do not want revisions to the Chicago Statement of Biblical Inerrancy because we know what they're going to do. It's going to turn the text of the Chicago Statement on biblical inerrancy into a wax nose in which they can formulate it any way, shape, or form that they want. Brown may not want to do this, but I guarantee others will want to do it. And Brown, you're not the only one who's going to sit at that table. You know it. I know it. Everyone knows it. You will most likely be a footnote or a paper in whatever book that they want that's being caught up in the reflexive fertile fallacy moment, fulfilling the narrative arc to revise our doctrine of Scripture. So again, thank you and have a good day.
10,000 years will give you such a crick in the neck.